Hey Cheve, what's happening? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we are studying Daf Ayin Gimel, Daf 73 of Masechta Ayruvin. Cheve, it already feels like we're getting pretty close, you know? There's only 32 more pages of Masechta Ayruvin. You guys gonna miss it? Oh yeah, you guys gonna miss it when it's done. There's like 1 month left of this. Alright, very nice. Very, very nice. Alright, right, Masechta Ayruvin, Daf Ayin Gimel. So for me, like the most memorable sugya was it's really pretty close to the beginning, which is the definition of what's considered makom dira, of the place where your house is, where like you will consider your house in terms of like the Eruv Chatzeros and stuff, where you're living. So and then we just kind of talk about different situations of like, you know, teachers and students and all different kinds of relationships and how that pans out in terms of Eruv Chatzeros. Then we talk about like more Mavui and Chatzeros, but like no like real big chidushim there, I don't think. So Chava, nothing we can't handle. Let's do it. So maybe let's start from the Mishnah on Ayin Beis Amud Beis. Even though it's a little bit high up, and I think we did it yesterday already, but it would be a good kind of running start for today. So let's do it. Mishnah on Ayin Beis Amud Beis, about, I don't know, maybe even like 15 lines from the bottom, but it's not very complicated. Okay, so if you had brothers who were eating by their father's house, okay? So they were dependent on their father, and the implication is right over here, is right now that they like mamash have all of their meals at their father's house. Yet when it's time to go to sleep, they have a separate house that they go to. Each one has their own respective house. So each one needs to contribute their own bread for the Eruv Chatzeros. Therefore, so therefore, if one of them forgot and didn't participate in the Eruv of the Chatzer, so then he would be mevatel his rishus to everybody else that they can carry in the Chatzer, all the other ones everybody else who participated. Emasai. When do the two brothers have to participate even though they're still being supported by their father? That is only if, let's say we have 5 houses in the Chatzer. One of them is owned by the father, 2 of them the children are living in, and then the other 2 are just random other people. So if the Eruv is being deposited in the house of one of the other people, well then the father and the 2 children each have to contribute bread. Aval imhaya eruv ba etzlan. But if the eruv was being brought to them, I don't know, maybe their father's house. So if everyone's putting the eruv in their father's house, well then oshein imayin diyun b'chatzer. Or if they're the only ones who live in the chatzer, it's just 3 houses, father and his 2 children. Well, in that case, einan tzrichin la'ariv. In neither case, right, in both of those cases, they would not need to put up bread for the eruv. They could all just rely on their fathers. Says the Gemara, so the Gemara wants to argue that from the fact that we see that even though they eat their meals at their father's house, nonetheless, they would each have to, right, since they have their own houses where they go to sleep, they would have to each contribute their own bread. So what does that tell us? What's important is where you sleep. It's not where you eat, it's where you sleep. Amarab, Yehuda Amarab, b'makable prashanu. Says Rav Yehuda in the name of Rab. Well, what does it mean that they rely on their father's table? It doesn't mean that they literally, every time they're hungry, they go to their father's house so that they can eat. It means that the father gives them an allowance, but they eat at their own houses. Right? So therefore you could still argue that what's important is where you actually eat. And where you eat is like a core tenet of Eruv Chatzeros, right? Right, the whole point of, you know, because it's about everybody living together in the same place, and we say that why do you dafka use bread? Because we say that you're considered to be living, that your mind is where your food is, where your bread is, and therefore, you know, it would make sense, therefore, you know, along that theme, to say that what's important is where your food is, not necessarily where you sleep. Okay. Taner Rabbanan, the rabbis taught Mishiyejlo beis shar achsadra umirpeses b'chotzer. Okay, so somebody who's got b'chotzer chaver, somebody who's got some kind of a gallery or something. In my mind, it's like maybe you have like an office, maybe like there's like a chotzer and you rent one of the spaces for an office, but it's not like you don't live there. B'chotzer chavero, hareze eno oser olav. It doesn't. You won't need to be involved in the eruv of that chotzer beis hateven. But if he's got like a granary, Beis HaBakar, or some kind of place where animals hang out, stable. Beis ha'etzim, or some kind of wood storage place, beis ha'utzaros, or some kind of other storage place. How is that oser olav? Well then, for whatever reason, that would be an Eruv liability. Okay? Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda, ein oser ela makom dira bavad. Rabbi Yehuda says, look, it has to be makom dira. It has to be a place of residence in order for you to have Eruv responsibilities. But if you don't reside there, well then you will not have to participate in their Eruv, and you won't make it osir you won't be osir on anybody else. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda, my said ben napacha. There was a story with ben napacha shayu lo chamesh. So it says here chatzeres, but there's a different gears that says otsaros, which kind of is nice, right? That he had 5 of these storage places, but Usha, in a place in Usha, which I believe is in northern Israel. Where I lived in Jerusalem, there's a street called Usha Street. And there's a very nice man who lives there. His name is Nadav Sterling. He's a very good person. Weiter. Uvamaisu lifnei chachamim. And the story came before the chachamim v'amru when they said, Eino oser ela beis dira bil vad. And the chachamim said that that only a beis dira is going to cause Eruv responsibilities. Meaning, so you had this fellow, Ben Napacha, who had all sorts of storage houses, but the rabbi said, don't worry about all of your storage houses. You don't have to come up with bread every single Friday and put it in all your storage houses. No, the only thing is beis dira. So the Gemara says, beis dira sakadaitech? What's a beis dira? So, meaning what, just like some structure? So, Ela makom dira. Okay, apparently makom dira is like a residence, whereas beis dira could just be like any kind of 4 walls and a roof. Apparently. Okay, my makom dira. So what defines this makom dira? What is this residence? How do you define a residence? So Rav Amar makom pita, Shmuel Amar makom lina. So Rav says that what defines a residence is the place where your bread is, where Shmuel says that what defines your residence is the place where you sleep. Meisvei, we have a kasha against Rav. Right, we have a kasha against Rav who says that it's where your bread is. What's the question? We have a brisa that says, Haroim Ve'akayotzin, ve'aburgnin, v'shomri peris, the shepherds, the fig watchers. Wow. Do we have any of the Babylon Talmud Chevers? Are you a fig watcher? Is that what you do? I would love to hear about it. Maybe it's interesting. Ve'aburgnin, and watchers, guards. V'shomri peris, and people who guard fruits. So if they normally sleep in the city, well then they're treated like the people of the city, and they would, I guess in terms of okay, fine. So then they'll be treated like people of the city. But if they normally sleep in the field, so then they have 2,000 amos in any direction from where they normally sleep. So what do we see? So we see that what's significant is where you sleep, not where you eat. Even though they eat in the city, even though they might go back to the city to eat, what's important is that if they're going to be going back to the field to sleep, well, that's where we're going to count for their Eruv Tchumen. Okay, but we see that what's important is sleeping. So my answer is yeah, but over there, hasam on side the imimatulu rifta hasam tfenichlu. But we say yeah, but that's not a good proof. Meaning, we want to ask a kasha against Rav, right? Because Rav said that what's important is where your bread is, but we seem to be saying over here that what's important is where you're sleeping. So we're answering it by saying that Rav can answer and say no. What is important is where your bread is. So why are we doing it based on sleeping? Well, the fact of the matter is they're only going to the city because, that's where the food, meaning if somebody was willing to bring the food to where they were in the fields, then they would totally prefer that because after all, that's where they're going back to later anyways. So even though they technically go to the city to eat, they would, preferably where they would want their food to be is where they are in the field, and that is why it goes based on the field in that case. But in general, where a person chooses for his food to be, that is where we would go based on. Amar Rav Yosef says Rav Yosef lo shmiya li ashmaito. I feel like we've been seeing this a lot recently, right? So Rav Yosef, of course, when he got older, he forgot much of his learning, and Abai would remind him of things. So Rav Yosef says, I never heard this teaching of Rav, that Rav says that what's important is the place where your bread is. So Amalei Abai. So Abai says to Rav Yosef, Ato Amart Nialan, what are you talking about? You told us this. V'aho Amart Nialan, and you told us on the following. Ha'achan shayu ochlan al shulchan aviyin, that the brothers who would eat at their father's house, our Mishnah, v'shenim b'vatein, and they would sleep in their houses, in not at their father's house. Tzrichin erev l'chol echad ve'echad. So they need to contribute a bread. Each of the father and each of the sons need to each contribute a bread. Ve'amrinan lach, and we said to you, Shmas mina makom lina garim. So we said to you, Rav Yosef, so don't we see from here that what's important is where you sleep, not where you eat? They're eating by their father, and they're sleeping in the other houses, and we see that because they're sleeping in the other houses, they have to each contribute their own bread. So v'amart lan, and you, Rav Yosef, said to us, Allah, about this, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Mekabel Prashanu, that Rav Yehuda said the name of Rav, that no, it's not talking about where they sleep. What's important is not where they sleep. What's important is where they eat. However, they aren't actually eating at their father's house. They're eating in their own houses, just their father is giving them an allowance, and they're using that money to pay for their food. But they're actually eating at their own houses, and that's why they each have to contribute their own bread. And what's important is, in fact, where your food is. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, so if you have a situation where you have this fellow and he has 5 wives, and he financially supports these 5 wives, and he has 5 servants, and he is supporting these 5 servants. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira matir b'nashim v'osu ba'avodim. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, so he permits by the women, meaning he has this chutzner. Now he's the only one who lives in the chutzner, and he and all of his wives and his servants, they all have their own houses, but all the houses basically are made up from this one sort of party. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira is matir b'nashim. He says that the women do not need to contribute to the Eruv. But the Avadim would have to contribute to the Eruv, and if they don't, then nobody will be able to carry. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava matir ba'avadim v'osu b'nashim. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is the opposite. He says that the servants do not need to contribute to the Eruv, but the wives do. Amar Rav, my time with Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Rav says, what's the reason for Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? How come he says that the Avadim do not need to contribute to the Eruv? Tichsiv v'Daniel b'sra malka. As it says by Daniel, that he was like always by the gate of the king, meaning even when he wasn't technically in front of the gate of the king, it's like he was always there. And we see from there that he was part of the household of the king, and therefore servants are considered part of the household of their masters or employers, and they wouldn't have to contribute to the Eruv. Pshita ben etzel aviv kidamaran. Okay, so of course it's obvious to us that if you have a son with his father, well, we know what the answer is from our Mishnah, that if they're in their own houses, well, then they have to contribute to the Eruv, and whatever the halachos are, was all listed in our Mishnah. Isha etzel ba'ila ve'eved etzel rabu, when it comes to a woman and her husband, or a servant and his master, plugta de Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Well, that's the machlokas that we just learned a second ago between Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira and Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava about if they need to contribute to the Eruv. Talmid etzel rabu mai. What about a student by his teacher? So you ready for this, Chevra? Tashma Kominir, the Rav Be'Rav Chia Omar, that Rav, by the house of Rav Chia, his uncle, said, in Anutzrichen la'ariv, we do not need to make an Eruv, Shari Anu Somchen al Shulchanu Shel Rav Chia, because we are relying on the table of Rav Chia, therefore we do not need to make our own Eruv, we can rely on him. Rav Chia Be Rebbe, and when Reb Chia was by Reb Yehuda Nasi, Omar, he said, "In anu tzrichen la'ariv, we do not need to make an eruv sharei anu somchen al shulchanu shel Rebbe, because we are relying upon the table of Rebbe." And Rashi says something interesting. Rashi says, "Talmud etzel Rabo," in the Dibra Maschil, Talmud etzel Rabo, he says, "Dar imo b'chatzor mekabel pras emenu," that he lives with him in a chatzer, and he receives some kind of payment from him. Interesting. Very interesting. And the next Rashi says, "The Rav Be'Rab Chia kishaya mikabel pras mi Be'Rab Chia," when you would get some kind of a stipend from Rab Chia. Interesting that there was some kind of a stipend situation going on, and for that reason, they relied on the Eruv of their teacher. But Amine Abaye me Rabba. Abaye asked a kasha from his Rebbe Rabba. Now Abaye also grew up in the household of Rabba, if I'm not mistaken. Chamisha shagavu es Ayruvin. So if you have 5 people who collected an Eruv, meaning you have a chutzner. In the chutzner there are 5 houses, and they all contributed to an Eruv. So they made an Eruv. If they want to bring their Eruv to another chutzner, i.e. to join together with another chutzner to make it one big chutzner, so Eruv echad l'chulan. So Abaye is asking Rabbah, in that case, can they contribute one bread for everybody, or would everybody have to contribute their own breads? Meaning they already all joined together in their chutzner, but now they want to join together with another chutzner. Do they have to produce 5 breads, or is one sufficient? Rabbah says, all you need is one bread for all 5 of them. But 1 second. But brothers who are in the chutzner with their father, and they're somech al shulchan aviyim, so that should be similar to these people who join together in an Eruv. Vikatani, and it says by the children, that everybody needs to contribute their own individual breads. So how come it would be different when it comes to the people who join together in an Eruv, where we say that they would only have to contribute 1 bread total for all of them? So the Gemara answers that the reason why, Rabbah answers that the reason why when it comes to the father and the children, why they each have to contribute their own breads, is because they're not the only ones living in the chutzner, right? There are people in the chutzner who people also live in the chutzner, and they need to contribute to the Eruv. Meaning, so keep on going for a second. That since they are also, these are also asur. Meaning, since in this chutzner, so it's not only the father and the 2 children in the chutzner, it's also 2 other people. And since the 2 other people are going to have to contribute to the Eruv, so therefore also the father and the 2 children also have to contribute to the Eruv. And then let's go weiter for a second. So achinami mistav, and it also makes sense to say this, the katani, because what does it say in our Mishnah when it continues? Emasai, when do they have to contribute the bread? That they only have to contribute, the children have to contribute the bread if they're taking the bread and bringing it to one of the other houses, right? So if they're collecting the houses, the bread, and depositing it in one of the other houses, well then everyone has to contribute. Aval, Yamaya Ayruvin ba'etzlam. But if everyone was contributing the Eruv to the father, or to them, or if there were no other people living with them in the chutzner, then they don't have to contribute another Eruv. So we see that if it's just the father and the 2 children, well then they don't have to contribute any Eruv, right? They're all good because the father is supporting them. So here also, if you have the 5 people who already joined together and they're one unit, they made an Eruv together, well, if they're going to bring their Eruv somewhere else, well then they don't need to each person contribute, they can just have 1 Eruv for all of them. Ba'amine Rav Chia bar Avin, Rav Sheshes, Rav Chia bar Avin, the Arisha b'Chabura. So he, right, the lion of the group, so he asked Rav Sheshes, Be Rav the Achli Naima Bebaiga. So if you have the yeshiva students who are eating their bread in some kind of a cafeteria, Ve'asu Uvaise Bevei Rav, but then they come back and they sleep in the yeshiva. So Kimashchina Lu Truma, when we measure their trum, Mibei Rav Mashchina Lu or Mibaga Mashchina Lu, do we measure it from the yeshiva or from the cafeteria? Meaning, so you have these students, and they have their yeshiva. Now they would walk. The cafeteria was 2,000 amas away from the yeshiva, in the middle of nowhere. Classic yeshiva kind of stuff. So you have the. Okay, so basically we have 2 options, right? Where are we considering that they're spending Shabbos? Are they spending Shabbos in the yeshiva, or are they spending Shabbos where they're eating? Right, basically, is it where they're sleeping, or is it where they're eating? Okay, so let's read that again. So, Ba'amine Rav Chia bar Avin Rav Sheshes, Rav Chia bar Avin asked Rav Sheshes, B'nei Beirav, so these yeshiva students, Ta'achlinama b'baga, that they eat their meals in the cafeteria, 2,000 amas away, as Rashi says, from where they're sleeping in the yeshiva. Ve'asu uvaisi b'veirav, and they come back and they go to sleep in the yeshiva. Ki mashchinanu truma, when we're counting the 2,000 amas of their tchum, min beirav mashchinanu, do we measure 2,000 amas from the yeshiva? Or do we measure 2,000 amas from the cafeteria? So Amarle, so Rav Sheshes responds, Mashchinan mi beirav. We measure from the yeshiva. V'arei nosen es Ayruvo b'soch apayim amma. But then Rav Chia bar Avin asked, but what about somebody who puts his Eruv 2,000 amas away from his house, v'asi uvayis bebeise, and then he comes home and goes to sleep in his house. We count the tchum from where he put his food 2,000 amos away. So meaning, when it comes to Eruve tchumen, if somebody takes some food and puts it 2,000 amos away and then goes back home and sleeps at home, he could it's still considered that, right, that he's kona shvisa, right? It's still considered that, right, that he's acquiring, resting, that he's spending Shabbos where his food is, even though he slept at home. So how come when it comes to the yeshiva students, we're saying, right, so if along the same line of thinking, I would say that if they're eating their food in the middle of, 2,000 amos away, that should be where they're kona shvisa, where we measure the 2,000 amos from. So Amarle, so Agosabach adds the words Amarle, so Rav Sheshes responds to Rav Chia bar Avin, Be'ahi, when Anan Saadeh uva'ado Anan Saadeh. He says, look, we could, we can clearly explain both cases. Be'ahi Anan Saadeh, right? We can attest, right? Literally, Be'ahi Anan Saadeh means we are witnesses. I mean, we can attest to the fact. We could say with certainty, the mitdar le hasam nicha le, right? That we can attest to the fact that when it comes to the person who put his Eruv 2,000 amas outside of the city, that's where he wants to be kona shvisa, because the only reason why he's going back home is because he doesn't want to sleep in the middle of nowhere, right? He knows that the reason why he put his Eruv there is because he knows that he has to walk there the next day. So if there was accommodations there, if there was a guest house over there, certainly he would stay by the guest house. So the only reason why he's going home is because he doesn't want to sleep in the middle of nowhere, but really he would prefer to be where his food is. But when it comes to the yeshiva students, we can also say with certainty, that the opposite is true, that if they didn't have to walk to the middle of nowhere to get their food, they would much prefer if the lunchroom was in the yeshiva and they didn't have to walk out 2,000 amas to go to the cafeteria. So therefore, in both cases, the bottom line is, says Rav Sheshes, is that it's where, it's basically where you want to be. And therefore, so in the case of, the, Eruv Tchumen, so you'd rather be 2,000 amos away where his food is. He just can't because he doesn't want to be in the middle of nowhere, so we can assume that he's kona shvisa where his food is, even though he's technically going home. And the opposite is true for the yeshiva students, even though they're sleeping, in the yeshiva, no, even though they're eating in the middle, 2,000 amos away, since they would prefer to be able to eat in the yeshiva, so we can consider them to be kona shvisa in the yeshiva. By Rami Bar Chama Rav Chizda. Rami Bar Chama asked his father-in-law Rav Chizda. Okay. Av uvno, a father and child, harav v'tamido, a teacher and his student, kirabim damu or kiyichidim damu. Are they considered like many people or like individuals? What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is in our beloved case of the inner chutzner and the outer chutzner, right? So we know that in the case of the, right, so there's an inner chutzner that doesn't have their own access to Rosh Hashanah. There's the outer chutzner that does have access to Rosh Hashanah. So the inner chutzner needs to pass by way of the outer chutzner to get to Rosh Hashanah, right? I'm sure that we've all had that drilled into our heads enough. So we know that in the inner chutzner, if they neglected to make an Eruv, well, that's going to cause problems for the outer chutzner, because they use the outer chutzner and they didn't, since the inner chutzner didn't make an Eruv, it causes a headache. Fine. So that is only, however, if there are many people who live in that inner chutzner. But if it's only one person who lives in the inner chutzner, well then there's no problem, right? Because he's allowed to carry in his own chutzner, and therefore he's not going to cause a headache for the outer chutzner. So what we're asking is, if you have a father and a son who live in that inner chutzner, or a teacher and a student, are they considered like many people, in which case they would cause a headache when there's the inner chutzner and the outer chutzner, or are they just like one party, in which case there would be no headache for the outer chutzner? Tzrichen eruv or ain't tzrichen eruv? Do they need to make an eruv, right? If there are two houses in the chutzner, one belongs to the father, one belongs to the son, do they have to make an eruv? What about the mavui, right? So if you have a mavui and you have two chatzeres that open up into the mavui, in one of the chatzers is live a father and a son. Well, the thing is, we said that in order for, if we remember way back when, so in order for it to be a proper mavui and to be able to be nitar belechi v'kora, so you'd have to have at least 2 chatzeros that have 2 houses in it. But if we consider the father and son and teacher and student to be like one party, well then, is it considered like a chatzer that has at least 2 houses in it in terms of having the halachas of lechi and korah for a mavui, being able to carry in the mavui by making a shituf and a lechi and a korah. So Amalei Tinisu. So Rav Chizda responds, look, we have a brisa. Avuvno harav tamido. When it comes to a father and a son, or a teacher and a student, bisman she'eni moen diurin, when nobody else lives with them, harein kichidim, well then they're considered just like one individual party. Ve'ein tzrichin la'arev, and they don't need to make an erev. However, umavui shaleh nitar belechi v'kora. Yet, if they're in a mavui, you can still consider their chatzar to have 2 households and 2 residences, and you will be, if you make a shituf mavos and have a lechi and a kora, so then you will be able to carry in that mavui. Chevra. New Mishnah. Chomish chatzeres psuches olazov psuchos lemavui. So if you have 5 chatzeres, one next to the other, okay? So let's say you're walking down Main Street, and to your right, there are, one chatzer after the next. And they all have a doorway going from one chutzner to the other, so they could theoretically just sneak in from one chutzner to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. They could walk between all 5 of them without having to go out to the Rosh Hashanah. However, the thing is that it's actually not, they're not open to Rosh Hashanah, they're open to a mavui. Okay? So you're walking down the mavui, and there are 5 chutzers in this mavui. So you can go into each chutzner from the mavui. Sure, there are 5 entrances, but at the same time, once you go into the chutzner, you can also, there are doorways connecting each of the 5, so you can also just walk from one chutzner to the next, via the doorways. Okay? Fine. So, Eruvu b'chatzeres, if they made Eruve chatzeres in all of the chutzers, okay? V'lo nishtatvu b'mavui, but they didn't do a shituve mavos. Mutarin b'chatzeres b'asurim b'mavui. Okay, so they'll be permitted in the chatzeres. They did Eruv chatzeres, they'll be permitted there, but because they didn't do a shitufe mavos, nobody will be able to carry in the mavui. Okay? V'im nishtatvu, and if they made a shitufe mavos b'mavui, mutarin kan v'chan, so then they're allowed to carry both in the mavui and in the chatzer. The question is that a shitufe mavos in addition to Eruv chatzeres, or is that in lieu of Eruv chatzeres? And it's not clear. We will have to discuss that in the Gemara. Eruvu b'chatzeres v'nishtatvu b'mavui, if they made an Eruv chatzeres and they did a shitufe mavos, perfect, okay, great. Except v'shachach echad mibnei chatzer v'lo erev. However, one of the fellows in one of the chatzers did not contribute his bread to the erev, so he basically messed it up for his chatzer, because not everybody in his chatzer contributed. Okay, mutarin kan v'chan, but we say nonetheless it's all good. You can carry in the chatzer as well as in the mavoi. Okay, so again, it's talking about where they did Eruv chatzeres and a shitufe mavos, but in one of the 5 chatzeres, one person forgot to contribute a bread. They said, don't worry about it, it's fine, you can carry in the chatzers and in the mavi. We'll explain that in the Gemara as well. Mibnei mavoi v'lo nishtatev, if you have one of the chatzers that did not join into the shitufe mavos, if you have one of the chatzers did not join in shitufe mavos, right? So all of the chatzers did Eruv chatzeres, all good, and 4 out of 5 of the chatzers joined in a shitufe mavos. So mutarin b'chatzeres v'asurim b'mavui. Well, then you will be all the chatzeros you'll be able to carry them because they did the Eruv chatzeres, but you will be unable to carry in the mavui. Because a mavui for chatzeres is like a chatzer for houses. That just like in a chatzer, all of the houses need to contribute, and if one house doesn't contribute, well then you can't carry in the chatzer. Well, same thing with the mavui, that all of the chatzeres have to contribute to the shituf and mavos, and if one mavui does not contribute, well then you can't carry in the mavui. Chaver, let's move on. Says the Gemara, Mani Reb Meir. Who is the author of our Mishnah? It is Reb Meir. What does the Mishnah say? Chamish chatzeres psucha zo lazo. I'm starting from the beginning of the Mishnah. That if you had 5 of those chatzeres, they're open to each other. Psuchas lemavui, they're also open to the mavui. Eruv b'chatzeres v'lo nishtatvu b'mavui. If they made eruv chatzeres but no shitufei mavos, mutarim b'chatzeres v'asurin b'mavui. That they'll be permitted in the chatzeros, but not in the mavui. And we're assuming that because we're saying that they can't carry in the mavui, even though they all made Eruv chatzeros, that must be like Reb Meir, who says that, certainly that, who says that Shitufim Mevos doesn't count for Eruv Chatzeros, and here where they did Eruv Chatzeros, everyone did Eruv Chatzeros, and we're saying that it doesn't count for Shitufim Mevos, it must be Reb Meir. I think that the Chacham would agree with that as well, if I'm not mistaken, that if you do Eruv Chatzeros, that doesn't necessarily count for Shitufim Mevos, but nonetheless, we're saying that it's Reb Meir. Fine. So Mani Reb Meir, he must be Reb Meir. The Amar that he says, Ba'inan Eruv, Ba'inan Shituf, that you need both an Eruv and you need a Shituf. Okay, fine. But one second, if we continue to read in the Mishnah, it says that if they do a shitufe mivoos, mutar kan v'chan. Well, then, as long as you do a shitufe mivoos, and we're assuming for now that what it means is that you didn't do an eruv chatzeres, right? So the 5 chatzeres came together to do a shitufe mivoos, but they didn't individually do eruv chatzeres, and we're saying mutar kan v'chan. They're allowed to carry everywhere. They did a shituf, and it counts for the eruv, and now you can carry everywhere. Ason l'rabbanon. So that sounds like the rabbis, the Amri b'chad the sagya, that they say that all you need to do is make either an eruv or a shituf. Meaning, if you do a shituf, you don't have to make an eruv chatzeres. So alo kasha v'im nishtatvu nami kamar. No, you could still say that it's Reb Meir. Meaning, Reb Meir is saying, so according to Reb Meir, you have to read the Mishnah like this, that if all the chatzers did eruv chatzeros, but they didn't do shitufei mavos, so then they can carry in their chatzers, but they cannot carry in the mavui. Great. But if they did make a shitufei mavos, meaning if in addition to the eruv chatzeros they made a shitufei mavos, then amazing, they can carry in the chatzers, in the mavuis, they can carry everywhere. But that's still Reb Meir's opinion. And the reason why they can carry everywhere is because they did both an eruv chatzeros and a shitufei mavos. Ema seifa, but one second, if we continue to read in the Mishnah, what does it say? Eruv b'chatzeres, if they made eruv chatzeros, v'nishtatvu b'mavui, and they also did shitufei mavos, okay, they did everything. V'shachach echad mibnei chatzer v'lo erev, but one of the people in one of the chatzers forgot and didn't contribute to his chatzer's eruv. Mutarim kan v'chan. So, nonetheless, everyone's allowed to carry in the chatzers, in the mavui. Heichidami, and what are we talking about? Idlo batil, well, if he was not mivatal's rishus to everybody else, right? Meaning, if this guy in one of the chatzers did not contribute to his chatzer's eruv, okay? So if he was mivatal his rishus, well, okay, great. Meaning, so 4 out of the 5 people that let's say there were 5 people in each chatzer, so 4 out of the 5 contributed to the eruv. One guy forgot, he's mivatal to everybody else. Okay, so he can't take anything out of his house, but everybody else can carry, no problem. Now, but idilo batil, if we're saying that he wasn't mivatal his rishus, i.e., so you just have an eruv that one person didn't contribute to, well then not everybody joined together and nobody can carry in the mavui, in the chatzer. So amai mutarim. Well then why are we saying that when one person forgets, nonetheless they're allowed to carry in the chatzer? Because if this is Rebbe Meir, the fact that they made a shitufei mavos does not allow you to carry in the chatzer. You still have to do an eruv chatzeres. And over here they didn't do an eruv chatzeres because not everybody contributed. So ela pshita de batil. So it must be talking about where he was mivatal his rishus, right? This guy who forgot to contribute is mivatal his rishus to everybody else, and now everybody can carry, and they can carry. So all the chatzers can carry. Everybody can carry in the mavui, and the only exception being this one guy who didn't contribute to the eruv in his chatzer. Maybe he can carry in the mavui because I think maybe he contributed to the shituf mavos, just not his eruv chatzeres. Okay, but ema seifa. One second. So if we're going to go with the storyline that this fellow in the chatzer was mivatal his rishus to everybody else in this chatzer, but if we continue reading in the Mishnah, what does it say? Shachach echad mibnei mavui, that if one of the chatzers forgot to contribute to the mavui, the shitufei mavos, so you have 5 chatzers that open into one mavui, 4 out of 5 of the chatzers contributed to the mavui, 1 did not. To the shitufei mavos, 1 did not. V'lo nishtatif mutarim b'chatzeres v'asurin b'mavui. So they're allowed to carry in their chatzers, but nobody can carry in the mavui because one of the chatzers didn't contribute. But v'ii debatil amay asurin b'mavui. And if we're assuming that he was that the chatzer that didn't contribute was just mivatil their rishus to the mavui, well then why are we saying that everybody's usher in the mavui, right? Meaning, if we're saying that when, in the first part of this, when one person forgot to contribute to his chatzer's eruv, so he was mevatel his rishus, and it's all good, well, then we should say the same thing, that when one chatzer forgets to contribute to the shitufei mavos, well, we're also talking about where they said, okay, we'll be mevatel our rishus to the mavui. But if that's the case, then why are they unable to carry in the mavui? And if you're going to say, well, because this is Reb Meir after all, and Reb Meir, for whatever reason, holds that you are unable to, a chatzar cannot be mevatel the rishus in a mavui. But that's not the case. We learned in a brayso, that Reb Meir said back when we were talking about Reb Gamliel and with the tziduki, that it was acceptable for the tziduki to be mevatel his chatzar in the mavui, and therefore the Rabbi Gamliel's family was able to carry, and they didn't have to worry about the tziduki because he was mevatel his rishus. So we see that Reb Meir, and that was Reb Meir explaining Rabbi Gamliel. So we see that according to Reb Meir, you can be mevatel rishus to a chatzar. So what's going on? If we're talking about where the guy was mevatel rishus to everybody else in his chatzar, and that's why everyone's allowed to carry in all the chatzeros and in the mavuis, well, then we're also going to have to say that in the case where one of the chatzers forgot to contribute to the mavui, well, that chatzar was also mevatel their rishus. Before that, why then are you unable to be carrying in the mavui if the only chatzar that forgot to contribute was mevatel their rishus? So ela pshita de lo batil. So rather it must be that what it's talking about in when the one chatzar forgot to contribute to the mavui, it's talking about where they were not mevatel their rishus to the mavui, because they were not mevatel their rishus to the mavui, and they also didn't contribute any bread to the shitufei mavos. Therefore, nobody can carry in the mavui. Now, umi the seifa lo batil, and if in the seifa they were the chatzar that forgot to contribute was not mevatel their rishus to the mavui, well then reisha nami de lo batil. Well then it must be that the reisha, i.e., when one of the people in the chevra in the chatzar forgot to contribute bread to the eruvei chatzeris, well, it must also be that he was not mevatel his rishus also, and for whatever reason, we're saying that even though he was not mevatel his rishus, still to his chatzar, still everyone's allowed to carry, as we said, in the chatzars and the mavuis. The question is, why? How could that be? According to Reb Meir, if you're making a shitufei mavos, that doesn't cover the eruvei chatzeris, and therefore why should they be allowed to carry in their chatzar if somebody in their chatzar didn't contribute? So reisha v'sefer Reb Meir mitzyaser rabbanon. Are we saying therefore that the reisha and the sefer Reb Meir in the middle is the rabbanon, meaning the reisha where it talks about that everyone would have to contribute to the eruv and the shituf, right? That the shituf won't cover the eruvei chatzeros, and also the Seifa, which says that if one person forgets to contribute to the mavui, so then you can't carry in the mavui. So we're saying that would be Reb Meir, but in the part where one person didn't contribute to his eruv, that would be the chachamim, right? Because the chachamim say that as long as they made a shitufei mavos, it would cover the eruv chatzeros, and therefore even though this one person didn't contribute to his chatzer's eruv, nonetheless, you would be able to, everyone can carry in the chatzers and in the mavi, because if we're saying it's according to the Rabbanan, as long as they made shitufei mavos, it would cover the eruv chatzeres. So the Gemara says, no, actually, kula Reb Meir, it's all Reb Meir. Okay, well then how do you understand the case when one person didn't contribute to his chatzer's eruv? How come they're still allowed to carry? Because what's the reason why Reb Meir says that even if you did a shitufei mavos, you still have to do an eruvei chatzeris? It's shelo lishkach toras eruv min hatinokos. The whole point is because we don't want the children to forget that there was a concept of an eruv. Well, here that's not really a concern, because even though yes, it's true that this one person forgot to do an eruv, but the other 4 chatzars did an eruv, and even within his chatzar, 4 out of 5 people did the eruv. Just one person forgot to contribute. So in this case, we don't really have to worry about people forgetting about eruv, and therefore, since they did a shitufei mavos, it'll cover the eruvei chatzeros in this case. And even though this person forgot to contribute, even Reb Meir would say that you can carry in the chatzars and in the mavoi. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, says Rav Yehuda in the name. No, Amar Rav Yehuda, says Rav Yehuda, Rav lo tani psuches zo lazo. Interesting. So Rav didn't teach psucha zo lazo, right? Our Mishnah said that you have 5 chatzars, one next to the other. They open up into a mavoi that they share between the 5 chatzars, but also each chatzar has a doorway that opens from one to the next. Rav Yehuda says that Rav didn't teach that there were these doorways. V'chein Rav Kahana, Rav lo tani psucha zo lezo. Rav Kahana also said that Rav did not teach that that these chutzers were open to one another. Rather, they were closed to one another, but they all opened up into the same mavui. There are those who say Rav Kahana gufe lo tani psucha zo lezo. Okay, there are those who say that it wasn't Rav Kahana saying the name of Rav, but it's Rav Kahana himself who doesn't hold that they opened one into the other. Okay, Amalei Abai Rav Yosef my time of the Rav. So Abai says to Rav Yosef, how come Rav didn't it said that we're not talking about where they're open to one another? So Kasavar, because Rav holds. So Rav Yosef answered Abai because Rav holds Kol Shituv she'ein machniso umotzio derech psachim b'mavoi lo shmei shituv. Because Rav Yosef says, because according to Rav, for shitufei mavos to work, you have to carry the bread through the mavui, right? So meaning, there are 4 chutzers. Let's say everyone's going to bring all of their bread to one of the to the 5th chutzer, right? There are 5 chutzers. 4 of them are going to bring their bread to the 5th chutzer, right? So Rav holds that they would need to take this bread, and if they're making a shetufah mivos, they'd have to carry their bread through the mavoi into that last chutzner, and that's how they make the shetufah mivos. But if they can carry the bread through the chutzers, through the opening from one chutzner to the next, without ever having to go through the mavoi, then it wouldn't be a good shetufah mivos. Part of the experience, according to Rav, of creating the shetufah mivos is walking your bread through the mavoi. Sounds very beautiful. Okay. Where am I? So lotani psucha zolazok savar kol shituf seim achnis darumaz b'sachim b'maver lo shmei shituf v'iter eisves. But we have a kasha. Bal habayis shutaf l'shchenav l'zeh b'yayin v'lezeh b'yayin. So as we learned the other day, if you have Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and each one belongs to a different chutzner in the mavui, right? And Reuven owns wine with Shimon, and Reuven also owns wine with Levi. So then they don't need to make a shiftufei mavos anymore because they already have a pre-existing partnership. But right, so ein tzrichen ariv, they don't need to join together because they're already joined together. Now over there, they're not necessarily carrying the wine through the mavui. It's already just in one person's chutzner. So Hasam the Afke va'ayle. So the Gemara gives an answer that Rashi admits, and it's very interesting that Rashi says this from time to time. In the Rashi Dibra Maskal the Afke va'ayle, at the end he says Vishinuya dechika hu, that it's not a good answer. V'lo ahavi maskana hachi, but don't worry, we are not going to conclude this way. So it's like sort of a not such great answer, but it's really just sort of a step along the process of the Gemara getting to its ultimate conclusion. And the answer that we give for now is Hasan de Afke va'ayle, that it's talking about where actually he did take the barrel and kind of move it from each of the chutzers into the mavui. So it did go on this journey from chutzer to mavui. Okay. But we have another question. Ketzad mishtatvin b'mavui v'chulei. How do you make a right? This is what it's a Mishnah later on. Yeah, it's a Mishnah later on, and it says, how do you make a shitufei mivos? So basically, somebody could just take one barrel of wine and say, this is for the entire mavui, right? As Rashi quotes the Mishnah, he says, maniach, right? Maniach es achaviz v'omer areze l'chol b'nei mavui. One person can just kind of take a barrel of wine and say, this is going to be for everybody. So over here, it's just one person putting a barrel of wine in his chutzner and saying, look, this is for everybody, and that's all he has to do. So over there, the wine isn't going through all of the different chutzers. So Hasam Nami the Apke va'ayle. So the Gemara gives the same answer. No, sure, no, he did. He put it on some kind of a wheelbarrow and he wheeled it into all the chutzers and back into the mavui. Okay, fine. Maskif la Rabba bar Rav Chanan. Rabba bar Rav Chanan asks the question. Ela me'ata. Let me ask you a kasha. Hikne lo paz besilo hachinami tulav v'shituf. No, if a person was just makne, his bread to somebody else, would that not work? Right? Meaning, if for the shitufim mivos, you have one of the people in one of the chutzers, or you have one of the chutzers, and they didn't actually, pick up their bread and walk it over to wherever it was. He was just makne it. He said, look, he transferred ownership of this bread to one of the people in the other chutzers, and that would be enough. V'chitema achenami. If you say no, there also it wouldn't work. But Rav Yehuda said the name of Rab, B'nei Chavura, Shayu Mesubin, V'Kiddush Aleim Hayom. Let's say, everybody was hanging out in one of the chutzers, right? There was a bunch of chutzers in a mavui. Everyone was having a barbecue on Friday afternoon, chilling out. And V'Kiddush Aleim Hayom. And the next thing you know, it's getting dark. And they say, oh gosh, we have a lot to do. So they say, all right, well, we better take care of the Shitufei Mavos. So, Hapas Shal Shulchan, Somchim Olav Mishum Erev Va'amrila Mishum Shituf. Well, guess what? They're making a barbecue, they have some bread over there. They say, you know what? We're just all going to come together and make a Shitufei Mavos with this bread, or an Ayruvin Chatzeros with this bread. And Rabbah says that the fact that some say it's an Ayruvin Chatzeros, some say it's a Shitufei Mavos, it just depends if they're in a house or in a Chatzer. Meaning that, right, there were two, right, so you have these people having a barbecue on Erev Shabbos, and they say, you know what? We have to all join together. So let's take this bread and join together on this bread. Some say that it was accomplishing an Ayruvin Chatzeros, some say it was accomplishing a Shitufei Mavos. Rabbah says it's no problem if they were eating indoors in somebody's house. So then we're talking about Ayruvin Chatzeros, because Ayruvin Chatzeros, the bread is put in one person's house. But if they were out and having an outdoor barbecue in the Chatzer, so then we're talking about the Shitufei Mavos, because the Shitufei Mavos goes into one of the Chatzeros. Beseder. What's the point though? The point is that they're all coming together on one bread that isn't traveling through all the different chutzers. So how are we saying that the reason why Rav didn't teach that there were these doors in between was because he wants to make sure that everybody, walks the bread through the mavui. The bread doesn't have to be walked through the mavui. So, Ella, Taima de Rab de Kosavar in Mavui Nitor Belechi Vikora Ad Shubatim Achzeres Psuchim Lesocho. Rather, the reason why Rab says that there are no doors between the chutzers, it's because in order for a mavui to be permissible with a lechi or a korah, you need houses and chatzeres that open into the mavui, not houses and chatzeres that open into each other. In order for this mavui to work as a mavui and to be mutter with the lechi and the korah and shitufei mavos, well, that is only if you have chutzers and you have houses in the chutzers and they open up into the mavui. But Rav would say if they open up into each other through these doorways, then you wouldn't be able to join together and carry in the mavui. Okie dokie. Well, that was Daf Ayin Gimel Masechta Ayruvin. So we talked about a bunch of stuff today. I think the most memorable machlokus was really at the very beginning about where's the definition of where you live in terms of having to contribute to the Eruv and the Chotzer. We also got into in terms of where your Kona Shvisa for Eruv Trumin. Rav said it's where your bread is, where Shmuel said it's where you sleep. I think that was kind of the biggest nafkamina. And then we talked about all sorts of stuff about, a father and a child, a student and a teacher, if they're considered to be residing in the same place. And then we got into this Mishnah with these chatzeres, with these 5 chatzeres that open up into the mavui. I don't think that there are any really big chidushim over here. We had the opinion of Reb Meir, who says that, even if you make a shitufei mavos, you still have to do an eruv chatzeres. And we played it out through different scenarios in these 5 chatzeres that open up into the mavui. Then we had this opinion of Rav at the end, that in order to be able to carry in a mavui, you need to have chatzeres that open up directly into the mavui, and not that they have doors going from one to the other. Chevra, that was Daf Ayin Gimel Masechta Ayruvin. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace.